Hello, this is Markus Römer again with a new GMP Detox session. Um, I thought about that I should have done this session maybe as one of the first sessions because there are still some discussions around that sometimes, and there's a lot of wrong information around that. I shared my screen again. Today we will talk about good documentation practices and documents and records. So here I share my screen with Amazon, a screen where you can buy also a book. It's called A Guide to Good Documentation Practices, GDP. So never use GDP, good distribution practices, for good documentation practices. The WHO has suggested to use GDocP, which I always use, but GDP for that is definitely wrong. If you go through this book, there are a lot of wrong informations. We can just have some fun to read that even the term GXP is not well defined. It's saying good engineering practices. There's a good laboratory practices, good distribution practices, good pharmacovigilance practices with GVP, but good engineering practice. The ISP is calling it for engineers, but basically it's wrong. And the CGMP, the Americans are using that, the US FDA, to say it's the current one. So even you might get a lot of very strange YouTube videos on good documentation practices. You often see if it's written GDP, then it might most probably be wrong. I have seen one YouTube video who was just showing the WHO basic GMP training slides with some background music. So let's talk about documentation. The overall word is documentation. And documentation, you could also call it documented information if you come from the ISO area. So documentation is documented information. And documentation basically has two major types. These are the documents and the records. And if I go to Gemini, we will also use some AI for today. Documents are instructions, so procedures. Here you see it, the answers by Gemini, examples, SOPs, for example, and records as evidence. So batch production records or device production records, device history records, for example. These are records. And in the predicate rules, they are named as records. So again, on the top level, documentation, and then you have documents as instructions and records as the evidence. And that's the difference between a document and a reference. I also asked Gemini, what is the overall goal of a quality system? Because if you look on quality systems regulations for medical devices or the PQS, the pharmaceutical quality system as defined in the ICH Q10 reference, for example, but you could also go to a usual QMS, quality management system, if you have a product or if you have a hotel or you want to sell ice or whatever you do, then you have a product and then you have a quality management system. If you would be IT guys, you would do services. So very important to understand that you apply the correct quality system to the area that you are providing. So services needs to have an SMS, a service management system. Anyhow, if you have a QMS, a PQS, an SMS, according ISO 9001, ISO 13485, ISO 20000 for IT, fantastic standard, by the way, or a pharmaceutical quality system according to WHO, the European Union, the US FDA, the CFDA, whatever, then you have one thing in common always, and this is continuous improvement. If you have a quality system, you want to have continuous improvement, and that just can come if you define what you do document, and if you do it, and if you have done it, and if you execute it, that you have the record, a proof of evidence. So you could change that, for example. So why is it that important? I have defined for myself a chronological order, what you would call also document evidence, science-based, right? So the chronological order of the terms are basically the first thing that you have is data. Data itself does not say anything. Yeah, you must have metadata around it. You need things to analyze that, to represent that. So data is put into a record. Data is captured and stored as a record. And if you have a record, you can analyze the data. You can get the information out of that. And based on that, you can do a decision. Whenever you did a wrong decision, maybe in your life or in business, you most probably had the wrong data because the wrong information was brought to you. I found that very interesting. I found it in Texas, in the library of the government. That's a nice picture. You see here data, unsorted information. They just put information before the record, and then you see the record. I just thought that's a nice picture to understand the relationship between data, information, and record. The document itself around that would describe how you manage that. You know, that's the procedure. In Europe, in GMP, drugs, pharmaceutical products, in chapter 4, you find that very nicely defined requirement, GMP documentation as the overall umbrella expression. And basically, it has two types. It's one are the instructions, what we call documents. These are directions or requirements, anything like this. These are the instructions, the documents, and then you have the records. They call it here the report type, where you provide the evidence of the actions that have been predefined in the document. If you have all of that, then you can improve your process or your product or reduce risk or something like this. There's also an example. If you bake a cake, the recipe would be the document. For example, you would say, I have the cake 12 minutes in the oven, and then you bake one cake, whatever batch number 1 of your cake, and your overall quality goal is to have always the best cake in the world. So for sure, that's the mission. And if you record it, so you write down 12 minutes in the oven, and now you found by default that the cake is tasting better at 12 minutes and 20 seconds, something like this, then you will change the recipe, the document. But if you have never recorded your document and your acceptance criteria, you can never make the process better. So that's the relationship: documentation, documents, instructions, and the record report types. I also have here something like a data flow diagram, which are using during data integrity analysis or something like this. You also see here on the left the instruction type, so documents, and on the right you have the record and report type. So these are the records. Altogether, this is your documentation. The good documentation practices apply to the documents and to the records. For sure, those needs to be handled a little bit differently. But here in the data flow diagram, you see you have the instructions, for example, the critical quality attributes, CQAs, the CPPs, critical process parameters, or the validated methods or something like that. Then you record the raw data. And now what happens is, out of this data, during the analysis of the data, whatever, during the day, you have 7,600 data recorded, single data points, for example, and you use that for calculation, and then you get out an information. And the quality decision maker, this horizontal line on top, is comparing your final record against the critical quality attributes. So again, documents and records, very important to understand that. I think that's one of the most fundamental basics of understanding any quality system principles. Documents and records altogether, these are documentations. Okay, thanks so much. That was it for today. Short intro to good documentation practices. If you Google for that, if you look into LinkedIn and into YouTube, today I was really shocked how much fake, wrong information you can find. Clear signal is if you see GDP, good documentation practices, and then a total mix-up of wrong information. Basically, it's simple. Keep it simple. There are documents that would be an SOP. You have records that could be a batch record, for example, batch production and control record, for example. So keep it simple, documents and records. I had this discussion also in another LinkedIn group, which is a fantastic site. And one was saying what I would deliver if an inspector, investigator, or an auditor would ask me, for example, can you show me your SOP documents? Then I would show the SOP. Yes, because that's the instruction how I will do that. If an inspector, auditor, investigator would ask me, can you show me your change control records? Then you can show your change records from change number 1 to 15, 20 of this year, or comparing it with the data with the records of last year, for example. If an inspector, auditor, investigator would ask me, show me your change control documentation, then I would put on the left the document, the instruction type, the SOP, and on the right, most probably in the first moment, a list of all changes from 2023, 2022, 21, and then I would ask which change control record would you like to see, which individual one. So that's very simple, documents and records. Okay, thanks so much. That's for today.